Hello everyone, and welcome to another one of our videos. Please take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy. Today we're gonna talk about the worst taboo historical facts that they don't want to teach at school.
Unless you were very rich, your family had one bed. Everyone slept in the same bed. And the husband and wife sure as hell didn't stop getting busy just because there were a lot of other people and children in the bed. At least in Europe it was also common for servants and guests to share beds. So it wasn't weird to sleep in the same bed with a stranger. People had a different concept of privacy back then. Another interesting tidbit. In medieval times, there is evidence that people tended to not sleep through the night. You would go to bed, and sleep for several hours, get up in the middle of the night for an hour or two, and then go back to bed for a few more hours before morning. One Australian Aboriginal tribe drilled holes in the shafts of their wieners in a coming-of-age ritual. That way, their juice would come out at the hole instead of the tip, and if the male wanted to impregnate a woman, he'd simply cover the hole. I'm not sure what tribe it was, but my source is Dreamtime and Inner Space by Holger Collawait. On the plus side, drilling a hole in my Johnny sounds less painful than paying child support. Cocaine enemas. I read Victorian medical texts and this was in one. They were also convinced that a lot of illnesses could be prevented by regular bowel movements, and thus were super into laxatives. Mummy medicine. And mummy paint. Yes, Europeans used ground-up mummies for everything. Nasty. If you have Irish or Celtic ancestors, the king had to have intercourse with a horse. And everybody was excited about it. Partable paternity, where husbands let a bunch of other dudes have intercourse with their already pregnant wife because they thought all the extra goosh would make the baby stronger. Some cultures believed that a baby wasn't conceived from a single event but was built up from regular intercourse, kind of in layers. The idea being that if different men sleep with the woman over the course of trying to conceive the child or while she was pregnant, the baby would inherit the positive traits of those men, as they all contributed equally. I don't believe this was a practice in societies where marriage was common. Though, as it's obviously polygamous and marriage typically is concerned strongly with allowing the male to be certain of the paternity of his children, which is based on a more accurate understanding of pregnancy. That said, in societies where multiple men believe they are all the fathers of a child, the child will have the ongoing support after birth of all of those men, which is extremely beneficial to the mother and child. It was something like the baby would have positive attributes of all. Scientifically, female bodies are totally fine for this. It seems a compatible sperm will fertilize and others won't. So it was a win-win for the society that time. People commonly used to share cups or drinking vessels because they didn't really know about germs. The Little House on the Prairie books have a few examples. When Laura went to town for the 4th of July, she drank lemonade from the same dipper everyone else in town did. Same thing when she went on her first train journey. The car had a jug of water in a tin cup, and everyone drank out of the same cup. Laura thought it was quite luxurious. Communal lavatories in ancient times also had communal wiping instruments. They were usually sponges, and to keep them somewhat sanitary they were soaked in vinegar. And the king often had a special servant to wipe his butt. The master of the privy chamber was actually a respected position, because it meant that the king trusted you. In the medieval ages when there was still no toilet paper, people would use a wooden stick to scrape away the feces after taking a dump. The stick would commonly be shared among people of the same household, or even the entire village. The term wrong end of the poop stick was coined because if you were to take a dump at night, and needed to grab the stick, you had a chance of grabbing the wrong end of it. In the 19th century England, people were creaming their pants over anything Oriental, but particularly Egyptian. And you know that nothing says fancy like buying a mummy. Yes, buying a freaking mummy. And having an unwrapping party where you and your fancy friends would gather for a night of amusement at your estate so you could basically desecrate a sarcophagus and poke a mummy. Serving beer to children so they wouldn't get sick from drinking sewage. That's pretty much what happened. If you don't feel like reading a long scholarly article, the gist of it goes like this. The nostalgic image most of us have about a farmstead with fresh well water leaves out one thing. The outhouse was a few meters away and the dump pit was unlined. Naturally this seeped into the groundwater, and just as naturally, what people figured out from trial and error was the water became safer to drink if they made it into small beer, which is a low alcohol beverage enough to kill off some of the nasties but not strong enough to dehydrate people. This is what everyone drank on a daily basis, not to get buzzed but to avoid getting cholera. There was no such thing as a drinking age until the 20th century. By which time, incidentally, people had also figured out the germ theory of disease and sanitation. Of course, the idea of handing a 6-year-old a brewski instead of a glass of water would be taboo today. Displaying your dead grandma in the parlor for a week in the summer. I saw something recently about wakes where the dead person is propped up doing something they enjoyed in life. Like an old man sitting in his favorite recliner with a beer rather than in a coffin. One picture was for a teenager and his body was sitting playing video games. Super creepy, but also kind of fun. Honestly, this is healthier than the death culture we have now that exploits people in a dark time. Always remember you have a right to the body. Postmortem photography. In Victorian times, unfortunately, people would die and the family would have no photos of them. Either they died young or they couldn't afford or justify spending money for photos prior. Now a loved one dies, you feel the need to get a photo of your loved one. So, you prop them up to look somewhat living and get a photo taken. Look it up. Gross and incredibly sad all wrapped into one. People married young. Old guys could marry girls as young as 6 in some cultures. Some women married young boys too. Pedophilia was common because people didn't live as long and pregnancy was really semi-permanent. A lot of girls by 21 already had several births. Marriages were also property negotiation in a way. I watched an Indian film called Water and I think the girl was only 9 years old when her old fogey husband died and he married her at 4 or something. So she had to go live forever in a widow house because she literally couldn't be around other people or her family because a guy she didn't even know passed away from age. The treatment of hysteria in women. Basically, you'd take your hysterical woman to a doctor and he would relieve the hysteria, if you know what I mean. In another culture, the act of nagging by a woman was considered a punishable crime. So offenders were fitted with a mask that had a protruding bar that held their tongue down to prevent them nagging their families. This reminds me of a mask I saw in Venice. It looked normal on the outside except it had no mouth opening or straps. The guide said it was for women who talked too much. In order to keep the mask on you had to hold a part of it with your teeth. Throwing your urine and poop out on the streets, before the invention and application of drainage pipes. I'm sure one would receive a taboo reaction today. Not only that, but it was pretty normal to go into a room and there would be human turds on the ground. Especially any common spaces that didn't have servants around to keep things tidy. Just lots of old turds everywhere. I recently learned that my grandfather had a sister that no one knew about. He grew up during the Great Depression and when his family moved states, they only had enough money to support 3 children. I don't know the specifics of what happened to his younger sister, but at the very least they abandoned her. Have a baby you don't want? Just leave it out in the woods somewhere and it won't be a problem anymore. Or just throw it into the river. I was reading a Swedish newspaper from the late 1800s and was surprised to see a few lines mentioning the finding of a dead infant next to a river. It'd be front page news today. This is called exposure. Spartans would even have the babies inspected by the state. If it was deemed defective, it would be exposed. The parents were not permitted to retrieve it under some severe penalty. Most other cases of exposure were voluntary by the parents. There was recently a post showing a 19th century picture of a dude sitting on his friend's lap. And someone responded to the community's surprise explaining that things like hand-holding and other physical displays of affection between platonic male friends used to, like 100 years ago, be normal in Western culture. I've always thought that people are more afraid of the gay than is necessary. But I'd never before seen so jarringly how sick our society is in that respect. Lobotomies were considered a valid medical procedure and were practiced frequently to treat, sometimes perceived, mental health conditions. It was considered perfectly reasonable to take essentially an ice pick, pierce it through the bone of the eye socket and wiggle it around until it severed the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain. It was sometimes done on perfectly healthy people with only the consent of their family. Usually because the person was different, and didn't fall in line with their family's expectations, so they were wrote off as mentally ill. This wasn't that long ago either, 1950. The guy who helped invent it and made it more mainstream eventually started performing them like a traveling salesman. He would travel the country operating out of his van.
Congratulations, you've made it to the end. We want to thank you again for giving us a few minutes of your time and we wish you have a great rest of your day, night, or whenever you're watching this. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to subscribe, it really does help us a lot. That's it from me, roll the outro.